Hi, my name's Justin Shelf and I'm the engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can install the Cloud Management Gateway within SCCM 1806. Now, I'm also working with Niall Brady over at windowsnoob.com, and he's going to be doing a blog version, so be sure to check out for that link in the video description below. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into the content. So the first thing I want to talk about within Cloud Management Gateway is give you a little overview of how it differs from internet-based client management. So if you've been following my guide, you might have noticed that I did a internet-based client management video a couple months ago. The key differences here between CMG and IBCM is mainly going to be, I would say, the complexity. So with Cloud Management Gateway, I've done plenty of internet-based client management setups when I was a PFE. And I have to say, I'm quite impressed with the simplicity of setting up the Cloud Management Gateway. So the key differences are, with internet-based client management, you would have to set up a site system that's going to host your MP, DP, and SUP roles to host your internet clients that they need to talk to. This would generally involve placing that site system in a DMZ, and that would often cause issues with ports being open from that site system to your internal site database as well as your site server. It could always be complex trying to get that set up. So although IBCM is free in the fact that you don't have any subscription costs, the complexity involved of getting the ports open and the appropriate connections for firewalls and things like that could always be quite complex. Cloud Management Gateway takes quite a bit of that complexity out of the picture because the server that's going to be initiating the connections for your internet clients is going to be in Microsoft Azure. So it's actually a connection initiated from the cloud management connection point out to that CMG server in Microsoft Azure, and it's done over 443. So it's an outbound connection, and then it initiates that channel. So you don't have to worry about things like opening up ports to your DMZ and the complexity involved there. So that's kind of the key difference between the two. Obviously, it is a subscription cost, so you will pay for content. It's relatively cheap. I'll be sure to include a link to the calculator that you can use to help estimate what kind of cost you might incur with content going out to CMG. So coming in, some of the prerequisites of Cloud Management Gateway. So it's quite similar with regards to certificates as the IBCM video that we did. So you are going to need a server certificate or a web certificate that's going to be used on the Cloud Management Gateway to initiate the HTTPS traffic for your clients. So that's the first thing. Just like you need a web server cert for your IBCM, MP, DP, and SUP, for CMG, you also need to have a web server certificate that's used to authenticate and secure that traffic from your internet clients. The next certificate that we need is the client certificate. So if you have clients that are domain joined and you want to be able to manage them on the internet when they go out and don't have access to your network, they do need to have a client authentication certificate. Now, I already did a video. I'll include a link in the top right of the video at this point where you can go and watch my video about configuring PKI within Active Directory and how we can switch our site over to HTTPS. So if you don't have your clients with certificates and your servers with certificates, you're probably going to want to start off with that PKI video that I mentioned here. Now, if your clients are Azure AD joined, they would not need a client authentication certificate. It would be able to use that connection and trust from Azure AD to communicate with the Cloud Management Gateway. So I think that's good to kind of cover some of the things that we need to have in place. So we're going to go ahead and jump over to our domain controller, and we're going to open up our certificate authority. So if you haven't watched that video, be sure to check out the PKI video. That's going to cover some of the things that we've been doing here. So the first thing that I'm going to do, if you remember, we created a web server certificate that was going to be used for our MP, DP, and SUP when we configure our site to use HTTPS. Now, what we need to do is duplicate that template. So we're going to go ahead and rename this to be Config Manager IIS Certificate -CMG. Everything else is going to be the same as the template that we created in our previous video. The only difference is we're going to allow the private key to be exported. The reason for that is when we configure our CMG server, we need to give it the web server certificate with the private key, and that's going to be uploaded to our CMG server in Azure, and that's going to be what binds to IIS. If we verify the security and the enrollment, we can see that my Config Manager IIS group that we created in our PKI video, we can see that they do have the rights to enroll this certificate like we created in the original video. So that looks good. What we're going to do now is right-click our templates and go ahead and issue that template so that it's being deployed to our environment. Now, if you wanted to, it's actually recommended you could use a third-party certificate authority to create your web server certificate as well. So if you wanted, you could use something like a DigiCert or really any third-party CA to issue your web server certificate. But in my video, I wanted to show you how you would create that if you did want to use your internal CA for the web server certificate for CMG. So jumping over to our Config Manager environment, we do have our site set up so that the clients can use HTTPS. So this is just coming over from our HTTPS video. So under our client communication, we have it set to HTTPS, and we also have it set so clients can use PKI certificates. And I do have the certificate revocation list enabled for clients to check the certificate, the revocation on our site systems. So like your MPs, DPs, and SUPs, so that they could check that CRL to verify that it's not revoked. So that's how we're kind of set up in our lab. So if you were going to use an internal certificate authority, what we're going to do here is go and request a new certificate. So I'm going to go ahead and do request. We're going to walk through our wizard, and we should see that new certificate that is targeting us. So here we go. Here's our SCCM. Actually, we want the CMG version here. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and enter in our DNS name. So this is going to be the public DNS name that you want to use with CMG. So you do need to have a publicly verifiable domain name that you're going to use. So in my case, it's setupconfigmanager.com. That's going to be what I initiate my instance with. So in order to do this, I'm actually going to use a wildcard. So we could potentially make our CMG server any subdomain that we want when we actually set that up. Now, if you knew what subdomain that you wanted to create, you could certainly enter that here if you didn't want to make it a wildcard. So that looks good. For the friendly name, we're going to go ahead and call this CMG server certificate, and then OK, and then enroll. All right. So if we do a refresh here, we can see here's the certificate that we just requested. So that looks good. It looks like I might have a few old ones here. Let me just get rid of some of those. Okay. So here's the cert that we just requested. What we want to do now is export that, and we need to export it with the private key, because when we set up our server, we need to make sure that we can give it the private key so it can actually make use of this certificate. We'll leave all the defaults here. I'm going to give it a password. Okay. Do next here. And I'm going to save it to a folder on my desktop. And I'm just going to call it Contoso Config Manager -HTTPS certificate. And then we'll go ahead and do finish, and then OK. Now, the next thing that you would want to do is make sure that you have your root certificate authority exported. So for example, we can see internally I'm issuing my client certificates and any other certificate from my certificate authority. Now, what you would want to do here is just go ahead and export that so we can import that into CMG so it trusts it. So you can just go through the default wizard here. We're going to go ahead and export that to the same folder on the desktop and then finish. Okay, that looks good. All right, so if we go over to our client settings, the next thing that we want to verify is that we enable the setting for our clients to talk to cloud distribution points. So under your client settings, there's going to be a cloud services option here. And then there's going to be a setting to allow access to cloud distribution point. You want to make sure you set that to yes, otherwise clients will be unable to download content from your cloud DP, so they won't be able to actually download things from the internet. So make sure that's yes, and we'll do okay on that. All right, at this point, I think we're good to go ahead and configure our Azure subscription within the console. So under our cloud services, we want to go to Azure services and we want to configure a subscription. So I'm just going to give it a friendly name. I'm going to call it config manager -Azure subscription. Okay. We want to make sure that it's cloud management. So that's what we need for CMG. We're going to do next here. Now we need to create what's called a web app and a client app. So these are going to be APIs that get created within Azure that's going to have all the authentication that we need for our on-prem components to talk to that service in Azure. So we're going to go ahead and choose create. And we're just going to give this a name called config manager -server app. I'm going to set the secret key to be valid for 2 years, and then I'm going to sign in with a global admin account. But one thing that you notice here, we're going to get some certificate errors. So if IE is enabled with enhanced security, what we need to do is go add the trusted sites, and we need to add Microsoft or login.microsoftonline.com. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that. And then we need to add microsoftonline-p.com. Okay, that looks good. We'll do close and then okay. Close IE, and if we come back in here, click sign in, now we can see that it looks good. So I'm going to sign in with a global admin account for my Azure subscription. Okay, there we go. All right, okay. So now we're going to choose that server app that we just made and click OK. We're going to basically repeat this process for our client app API. So we're going to choose create. We'll call it config manager -client app. Going to go ahead and sign in. And then OK. And then we'll go ahead and select that and then choose OK. So we'll do next here. Optionally, if you want to allow your config manager site to discover cloud identities, you can do that here. That's fine. I'll just leave that default and then choose next here. All right, so while that's configuring it, if we jump over to Azure and if we go to our dashboard, under the app registrations, now if you don't see this, you might have to go into all services, and then you can come in here and search app registrations, and then I went ahead and added it to my favorites over here. So if you open up that, click view all applications, you should see those 2 applications that we just created. So we're going to go ahead and click the client app. We want to click on the settings tab here. We want to go to the permissions, required permissions, and then we need to grant it permission so it can communicate with our site. So that looks successful. We're going to close that, close that, close that. And then we need to repeat that process for our server app. So we're going to go to settings, permissions, grant permissions, and then yes. So that's going to make sure that we have the appropriate permissions to do our discoveries and talk to these applications in Azure. So that looks good. So if we come back over and we go to our cloud management gateway, we can go ahead and right click and choose to create. So there's a new feature that came out in 1802. Also, of course, it's available in 1806, which is what we're running. It makes it quite a bit easier because you don't have to upload a management subscript or management cert. You can just use this Azure Resource Manager. So in order to do that, all we have to really do is just sign in to our Azure account, and it can configure all it needs to set up the Cloud Management Gateway instance within Azure. I'm going to go ahead and log in. Now, one thing to note is that I was having an issue where my subscription ID would not populate here. It would bring in the Azure app, but it wouldn't bring in the subscription. And in my case, I actually want to choose this second subscription as what's active. But the reason why the subscription ID might show blank is because even though your account is a global admin, what you have to do is make sure that within the subscriptions in Azure, that the account also has access to the subscription. So in order to do that, if you click on your subscriptions and then go to account control over here, you just need to make sure that your account is a co-administrator and an owner. So I just added my account in here by clicking add, and I made sure that it was a co-admin as well as an owner. Once you make that change, if you come back in here and run this again, you should have your subscription auto-populate. Right, so we'll do next here. And now this is where we actually configure our Cloud Management Gateway settings. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I want my instance to be set up in West US in Azure. The next thing that we can do here is choose whether we want to use an existing resource group within your Azure subscription, or what we can do is create a new resource group. In my case, I'm going to create a new one, and I'm just going to call it CMG Setup Config Manager for the name. Okay. Now, we do need to add some certificates. So this is where we would add the server or web server certificate for our instance of CMG. So in my case, here's our certificate that we issued from our internal PKI. But what I'm actually going to do is I have a DigiCert certificate that is also a wildcard for setupconfigmanager.com. So I'm actually going to choose that public one. That way my clients can perform a certificate revocation check that we saw in the properties of our site. If you use an internal one, you will need to make sure that your CRL is using a HTTP path that is accessible from the internet. So just keep that in mind. All right, so since this is a wildcard certificate, we need to essentially tell CMG what we want our subdomain to be. So we need to go ahead and delete that wildcard. And in my case, I'm going to go ahead and call it the same thing as my resource name. So CMG Setup Config Manager .setupconfigmanager.com is essentially going to be the public DNS name that we're going to redirect to our Azure domain. So that looks good. Now, if we go over and just click out of that, it should pre-fill in our service name as well. Now, what we also need to do is specify if you're using an internal PKI for your clients instead of Azure AD for joining, we need to tell CMG what certificates we need to trust. So when we exported that root certificate from our root CA internally, this is where we can put that certificate within CMG. Now, if you have intermediate issuing CAs, you could also add those here and define that they are a sub-CA of your root. So you just want to make sure you add any certificate authorities that is issuing your client certificates within your environment. All right, so now that we have that public DNS name that we actually want to use, we need to make sure that that's actually resolvable. So what I'm using for my setup config manager domain is I'm actually using Cloudflare for DNS. So in order to make sure that this works correctly, what we're going to do is create a CNAME. So we're going to go add a new record. This should be pretty similar if you're using other DNS providers like GoDaddy or really whoever you're hosting your domain DNS with. It should be a similar process. So what we want to do is create a new CNAME, and we can see that we are what we want to do is copy that subdomain, and we want to make that our CNAME. So we're going to basically be pointing CMG setupconfigmanager.setupconfigmanager.com to CMG setupconfigmanager.cloudapp.net. We don't want to add any type of proxy or CDN that Cloudflare offers, and we want to go ahead and add that record. So that looks good. So we've got that redirecting. So we have that set and ready to go. Now, one thing to note is that this name here, the service name, it does have to be unique. So if you chose something generic and you get a little exclamation here, you're going to have to go ahead and rename it to something more generic that somebody else isn't using, because you can see you get your own subdomain on the cloudapp.net that resources are going to be essentially talking to. So that looks good. We'll leave the defaults for the alerts. I'm not too worried about that. And then we'll go ahead and choose next here. And what that's going to do, that's going to start initiating our instance in Azure, get our CMG servers set up and going. Now, if we want to monitor the process of this, if we go to our site server logs, we're going to have a new log file here called Cloud Manager. So this can take maybe 10 to 15 minutes, I would say, on average from what I've been running. So I'll just kind of monitor this log and we'll come back once it's complete and it's provisioned. All right, so it looks like that the setup was complete. So if you go back to your console and go ahead and refresh the Cloud Management Gateway, you should see something like the status is ready and provisioning has been completed. Now, once this is set up, in 1806, we do want to change a few options that are new to 1806. So if we go to properties of our CMG, then under settings, there's this new option here to allow the CMG to also function as a cloud distribution point. So we want to make sure we go ahead and enable this option. This is actually quite convenient because you don't have to go in and create an additional resource group in Azure and create an additional cloud or cloud distribution point. You can just use your CMG and have it also host your cloud content as well. So this was an improvement in 1806. If you're using 1802 or before, you would actually have to set up a cloud distribution point in order to stage content. Now, one setting that I am going to also disable is verify client certificate revocation. So within my Active Directory certificate servers or my PKI environment, I don't have my certificate set up in a way on my client that they can be publicly verified using a HTTP CRL. So if you remember in our site, we did enable the clients to check the CRL of our site systems. So since our CMG server is using a DigiCert certificate, the client shouldn't have any issue checking that CRL that we have enabled in our site. And just to kind of show you what that looks like, if we look at our DigiCert certificate that I use for my web server and CMG certificate, if we look at the certificate details and look at the certificate CRL distribution point, what you can see is that it's a public path and it will have no access for the clients on the internet to gain access to that. So if you are using an internal PKI, in order to enable the CRL checking of client certificates, if we come back to our cloud distribution point, you would need to verify that the client certificates that you're issuing, they have a public CRL HTTP path that the CMG server out in Azure would be able to verify. In my case, in my lab, that's not set up, so I want to make sure that I uncheck that. Otherwise, when clients try to talk to your CMG, the client would get a transient error and IIS would deny the traffic because it wouldn't be able to check if that certificate's been revoked for that client. Now, obviously, this can be a bit more complex because it really kind of goes outside the scope of Config Manager and it's more on PKI, which would most likely be handled by a different team. But I will include a link to my PKI video as well as Niall Brady's PKI setup as well. I know that he does cover doing things like setting up a HTTP certificate revocation list in case you did want to make sure your client certificates could have their CRL checked by that CMG server in Azure. Right, so I think that looks good. So we'll go ahead and wait a couple minutes. It should auto detect that you changed the setting, and then you should see that it's going to go ahead and update the CMG configuration. All right, so it looks like the configuration is now synced. So our CMG server should have those new settings where we enabled it to, actually it looks like I might have unchecked that. Let me go ahead and check that again, and we'll wait for that to complete. Okay, so that update is complete. One thing I do want to show you though is that what I did is I increased the resolution. That's why you might see that things are being a little bit cut off right now. But I knew the wizard looked a little bit different. It looks like since I was recording with low resolution, it actually cut off a few of the options that would otherwise be available during the initial setup. So those options for the allow the CMG to be a cloud DP and the verify CRLs, they're actually generally going to be available directly in the setup when you go to setup CMG. It looks like in the current technical preview, this is 1806.2. It doesn't look like it scales or adds a scroll bar here. So just keep that in mind. Generally, you could configure this when you set up CMG. But in my case, it looks like the resolution was a bit too low for my console and it didn't display those options during that initial setup. All right, so that looks good. I've just scaled back to what we were at before. Now, I am pretty certain that I am using a resolution that's actually high enough to be supported. So it wouldn't surprise me if that just might be an issue in the technical preview, because I did want to make sure that I show you this new option where you can make CMG also be your cloud DP. So that's why I'm running the 1806.2, but it's currently July 17th. So 1806 will probably go live anytime now. So now that we have our cloud management gateway set up in Azure, the next thing that we want to make sure we set up is our connection point. So if we go to our servers and site system roles, in my lab, it's quite simple. I'm basically running all my site system roles on my site server. So we're going to go ahead and add the connection point here. So if we go ahead and walk through our wizard, we're going to install the Cloud Management Gateway connection point. So that's going to be what proxies the traffic, if you will, from your CMG server in Azure to things like your MP and your software update point. So clients can kind of come through that channel to do things like scanning and getting policy. So it looks good. We can see that it automatically detected the CMG instance that we set up here. We're going to go ahead and do next and then next here. All right, so that looks good. Close out of that. Now what we need to do is set what management points and software update points that you want to allow to be used within CMG. So what MPs and DPs is our CMG from Azure going to use when it's proxying that internet traffic from our clients into our on-prem site for getting policy and doing software update scans. So I'm going to go ahead and do properties of my management point. Now, one thing that you notice, in order for the management point to be used with a Cloud Management Gateway, it does have to be in HTTPS mode. So in my case, it's already set to HTTPS. So like I've already mentioned, if you don't have that set up, I've got a whole guide, and I'll be sure to include the link in the description, as well as a little note within the video here that you can go check that out. So as long as your MP is set to HTTPS, we have this new option that says allow config manager cloud management gateway traffic. So that looks good. We'll do okay on that. Now, same thing with your software update point. We want to make sure we enable it. Now for the software update point, it can work over HTTP. So we could just be running our software update point on 8530 or port 80. It doesn't necessarily have to be configured to require SSL. We can still enable that traffic for the cloud management gateway, even if your software update point is running in HTTP mode. So we'll do okay on that. And we'll go ahead and just wait a few minutes to make sure all that policy kicks in. All right, so what we're going to do is go ahead and distribute an application. So we have a 7-zip application. We're going to go ahead and right click and choose to distribute content. We're going to go ahead and choose next here. And we're going to go ahead and add that cloud distribution point that was configured for CMG for us. So we're going to go ahead and add that, choose next here, and get that distributed, because that can take a couple minutes. Now, what I'm also going to show you is third-party updates. So what I've got here is I've got a software deployment package that's hosting all my third-party update content. Now, one thing to note that since third-party updates are going to be unique per your environment, so they're going to be using your code signing certificate if you had those, and if you were publishing updates, for example, from our Patch My PC catalog, you would need to make sure that you also distribute that type of content to your Cloud DP. Because it wouldn't be available from Microsoft Updates. So if I go and look at this update package, we can see that I've got all my third-party updates, but I don't have any Microsoft updates. Now, for example, for my Microsoft Update packages, you would not have to distribute these because your clients that are out on the internet, they can actually use Windows Update to get the binaries for updates that you deploy through Config Manager. So I probably wouldn't ever worry about distributing your deployment packages for Microsoft updates, because it would just be consuming data and content that you don't need, because those clients can just go out to the internet since they're already out there. So what we'll do, we'll just kind of wait for that content to distribute, and then once that's done, we'll jump over to our client, and I'll kind of show you the process of how the client would switch over to the internet and how we can verify that it's talking. But actually, before we jump over to the client, what I'm going to do is go back into Microsoft Azure, refresh my portal, and we can see that we have this new resource for our subscription that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and go into this cloud service. And what I'm going to do is enable remote desktop. So because I generally like to go a bit more in detail of what's happening on the back end, we're going to go ahead and enable RDP, and we're going to remote desktop into our CMG server out in Azure. So we're going to just go ahead and give it a password here. And I'm going to choose one of the default certificates that are going to be loaded here for RDP. And if optionally you can configure when you want your account to expire, I'll just leave the default of a month and choose save. Now this can take a few minutes, so we'll go ahead and pause the video. All right, so it looks like RDP was configured successfully now, but one thing I did notice, this has happened multiple times. So if you try to RDP in directly, so if you come to the overview of your instance and then click on the RDP session here, that's going to go ahead and download you an RDP file if you click connect here. But one thing I did notice, it will time out. It seems like there needs to be a restart in order for it to start working right away. I'm sure if I just let the VM sit and fully configure this, it would most likely work within a little bit of time. But I'm noticing that if you just try to remote in directly after it says it configured it, it seems to time out and say that it's not available. But what we can do here to kind of work around that is if you reboot your server, so if we click on this instance and click restart, I'll go ahead and pause it, but after that restart, I've noticed that it will go ahead and allow the RDP to work right away. All right, so our server restarted. So what we can do here is if we go and open that RDP file that we got downloaded, we should go ahead and click connect. And now you can see that RDP is up and listening on that Azure system. So I'm gonna go ahead and log in with the password that I created with that local account. And what we can see, we're actually RDP'd now into the CMG server that's hosting that connection. Like any good SCCM admin, of course, the first thing that we do is get CM trace copied over and set that for our default log viewer. Now, what you'll notice is that this kind of configures some different disk on your CMG server. So the first thing you might want to look at is go ahead and open regedit. And then what we could do is kind of go into our software key under HKey local machine, Microsoft, and then SMS. And then you could just get an idea of where your CMG components are installed. So if you look at the tracing key and you look at your setup, we can see that it's in the E approot logs CMG setup. So if you want to actually just verify that the CMG components are running, if you go to the E approot and then logs, here's our CMG service log. And we can also see our CMG setup log. So this will just kind of let you know, hey, things are running, it's connected to your connection point and things look good as long as everything's looking like it's online here. So that looks good. The next thing that might be of interest is if you want to open up IIS, we could go ahead and open that up. And here's our essentially our components that are running our CMG service. So if we go ahead and open that up and look at the logging, you can just get an idea of where your IIS server is logging out. So we'll go ahead and copy this directory, open that up. And this is basically our IIS log. So this will show you any type of traffic coming in from your internet client. So if you're trying to troubleshoot any type of connection errors you get on your internet clients, this could be a helpful place to look. Now, instead of rolling over hourly, I'm going to make this log weekly, just so we can kind of view the log by week, so it doesn't roll over quite so much. But that all looks good. So it looks like we're up and running. If we come back to our SCCM console, so minimize this RDP, we can see on our content, so under our distribution status, if we go and look at our cloud DP that was configured with CMG, we can see that all the package has successfully been distributed, and we've got all our content ready to go for our clients. So if we jump over to a client, what I can see here is I've got a client that at this point, it's just running internally. It is using a certificate because that would be required if you're domain joined and not using Azure AD. But we can see that it's using PKI. So what we're going to do is go ahead and start the agent. If we look at the network tab, we can see that we currently don't have any internet-based client management points configured. So this would also include CMG. So by default, every 24 hours, the client is going to do what's called a content locate or a location request. So the location request is going to be when it would pick up any new available management points. So if we look at client location.log, what we can see here is that it picked up that new cloud management gateway server. So that looks good. Now this would also automatically do a location request if you were to connect to a new Wi-Fi network, or if this service was to be restarted. So if you were playing around with this and you didn't want to wait the default up to 24 hours, you could just restart the SMS agent host service and that would initiate it. So if I close my config manager applet and reopen it, and we look at that network tab now, we can see that it's now populated with the CMG server. So if you remember from our video where we created that subdomain, let me actually go back to my server for this. If we actually do an NS lookup on this, so NS lookup, then we've got CMG setup config manager.setupconfigmanager.com. So that's the subdomain or CNAME that we created. We can see that that's now pointing to our Azure IP. So that's why we had to create that CNAME to point our certificate to basically redirect that to the cloud app, which is where our Azure CMG is running. So that's going to be how our clients can actually connect and detect that. All right, so that looks good. I think at this point, we're pretty much up and running. So if we jump back over to that client, it's currently on the internal network. So we can verify that. If we go look at our CCM messaging.log, we can see that it's currently going to be talking to our internal management point. It doesn't look like I've got any traffic going on recently. But what we're going to do in order to switch that to the internet is I'm going to switch my VM from my internal Ethernet that's connected locally to a guest network over Wi-Fi. So I'm just going to go ahead and initiate that. We're going to go ahead and make this full screen again, and I'm going to go ahead and restart the agent host so that it detects it's on the internet now. So one thing to note is that if you're using Hyper-V and you just switch the network, it's not going to detect the actual adapter change like if you were to reconnect to Wi-Fi. So in that case, we're going to just go ahead and restart the agent host, and we'll go ahead and monitor client location. And now we can see that it says the client is domain joined, but it's on the internet. So once it detects it switches to the internet, if we go and look at location services.log, what we should essentially see is the client will then start switching to use our CMG management point. So if we take a look, now that we're on the internet, if we go back to our console here, and if we do a refresh, we can still see that the client is showing that it's on the online. So even though clients are online, it can still use the fast channel to get notifications. So what we can do here, let's give this a quick test to see if this is fully functioning yet. We're going to go ahead and choose to go to our device collections, devices, and then we're going to right click our client and choose to do a software update scan cycle. So evaluate software update deployments. Now before I click OK, what we'll do, we'll jump over to the client and we're going to open up updates deployment.log. But also we're going to open up scan agent and then updates deployment and merge those two logs. And then we'll jump back and go ahead and say, let's perform that scan. So we'll see if that kicks in here in a few seconds. There we go. We can see it just got that notification that was triggered from our on-prem environment, even though this connection is out over the internet. So the fast channel will still work. Of course, most of your components, so doing things like hardware inventory, application deployment, software updates. I'll include a link to the description of what's supported over CMG. Now, obviously, there's a few things that aren't supported, so you couldn't do things like Pixie booting for sure. You couldn't do remote tools because it would be out on a public IP address. So there's a few features you can't do, but for the most part, you would manage this just like any other client. So what we can do to just test to verify that we can get things like applications and updates is we'll go ahead and try to install an application. So you can see that we don't have 7-zip installed currently, but I've got this targeted. Now this is an application that we made sure that we distributed to our cloud, or let me make that our CMG server now that they're kind of integrated into our Cloud DB and CMG server. So if I go ahead and click install, what should happen if we come back to our logs and look at the content access log, we should see that we're downloading our content from our CMG server. So if I zoom in on that, we can see that we detected that content is on our cloud server. So that's going to go ahead and download that content. In our case, it was just 7-zip. So if we go and look at our cache, we can verify that 7-zip got downloaded and it should have been installed. So now if we go back and refresh, we can see that our software distribution works just fine for those clients over the internet through CMG. Another thing that I thought would be interesting is looking at Windows updates. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click on this Microsoft update for Flash Player. Now, this is one that we don't have out on our CMG server. This is one that would go out and get it from Microsoft Updates. So for example, we can see that when it does our content location to get that update, we can see that it's actually downloading that binary from Windows Updates. Because obviously you wouldn't need to host that because it's already out on the internet and available. So we can see that it's been downloaded. So if we go and look at our cache, we can see we now have this new folder for that Flash update. So that's going to be coming through Microsoft Updates. The next scenario that I wanted to test is third-party updates. So what we've got here, we've got an outdated version of Java. So we'll go ahead and choose the 32-bit version for this example, and then we'll choose to install. Now, this is one that's hosted out on our Cloud DP or our CMG server. So we'll go ahead and wait for this to finish, and I'll show you how that gets accessed. All right, so that update also installed. So if we go and look at our CAS log, we can see that we got the content from our CMG server as well. Since that was a third-party update, it was distributed from our cloud service. If we go and look at our cache, we can verify that the third-party update was in fact downloaded. We can see we've got our Java update here. If we do a quick refresh, we should see that we went from Java 8.161 to Java 8.181 for the 32-bit version is what we installed. We can see we got 7-zip installed, and if we look at our updates, we've also got that Flash update that installed as well. So it looks like our client is functioning just fine out on the internet through CMG. The only other thing that I'll go ahead and kind of show you is let's go ahead and do one more client notification. So jumping back to our console, let's right-click the device and do a hardware inventory. There we go, collect hardware inventory. So before we initiate that, let's look at the inventory agent. I did clear the log files before I started this service, so let's go ahead and initiate that. And let's see if that inventory agent gets created here once it gets the policies telling it to do a scan. There we go. So we can see that real-time action got sent to our client through the fast channel. Even though it's on the internet, CMG was able to broker that connection and say, hey, go ahead and submit hardware inventory for me. So at this point, we can see that it's submitting the inventory. If we get back over to our site server fast enough, we can look at the dataloader.log and we can actually see this inventory file that gets sent through our connection point from our CMG server. It should basically flow into our site server through the internet. So we'll wait for that client to send it up. We can see that the file just got sent up to our management point. So the client would send that up to our CMG server out on the internet. That would then proxy the connection through the connection point, and basically that MIF file for the hardware inventory should flow over to our data loader, and it should get processed here in a few seconds, hopefully. There we go. So we can see that it just processed that inventory file. We can see that the hardware inventory was in fact for our device called SCCM client. So that is the machine that's out there on the internet. One other thing that I thought might be interested is if we look over at our IIS logs, what I've done is I've opened up my software update point scan log for IIS. So what we can see is that when the client was scanning for updates over the internet, we can see all these updates are coming over and it's scanning. We can see it's using the internet IP v6 address of our proxy connection through CMG and our client. But this is in fact the client out on the internet, and we can see that it's out there scanning, and this would be kind of what's brokering that connection through that connection point. So I think that's all I had to cover. Now, if you have any questions, I know that we didn't go too deep in on the PKI aspect of it because I already have a video on that. So if you do have any questions around CRL checking or certificates that maybe I didn't go deep enough that you have a question about, feel free to leave a comment in the video, blog post, Twitter, wherever you're reading this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful for you.